In a fast-paced world of cutting-edge technologies and new frameworks coming out all the time, have you ever wondered what really lies at the heart of web development? The real essence of making beautiful and functional websites? As a web developer, there's nothing more important than mastering your core foundations, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which is exactly what this video is going to help you guys with. Hey, how's it going, guys? This is Max here from Deal Development, and today we are going to be building this cool little image slider app using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's a very basic little app with an image here in the middle, and we have these previous and next buttons which we can click to cycle through our images, just like this. And we have this nice little fade animation when we cycle through our images. And that's pretty much it. So whether you're an advanced React developer wanting to just get back to the basics, or you're an actual beginner and you need to learn the basics, I think this will be a fun one and something to sharpen your skills. So with that out of the way, let's get started on it. Cool, so over on our desktop we can right click and make a new folder, and I'll just call this image slider app. And we can right click that, and assuming you have Visual Studio Code, you can go ahead and open that up. And it should bring up a new window of VS Code for you. Cool, so once you have your project open in VS Code, the first thing I'm going to do is simply add my images folder. So I'm just going to copy this over here. You can see we have this images folder, and we just have 3 images right in here. I've just called them 1, 2, and 3. And they're all JPEG files in our image folder. So next thing we're going to need is our HTML file. And in order to do that, I can just create a new file called index.html, just like that. We will also need some CSS. So I'll create a style.css, just like that. And finally, the way we're going to make this all work, the real magic, is of course the JavaScript. So I'll just make a main.js file. Now before we get started with our HTML, I just want to mention that I'm going to be using the live server extension. So if you don't have it, just search for live server in your extensions and go ahead and install it. It'll help you to launch a live server very quickly and easily so we can view our app. So once you have your live server extension installed, you can head over to your index.html file, and if you just put here an exclamation mark, the Emmet extension, which comes built in with VS Code, should provide you with a boilerplate HTML if you just push enter, just like that. And so from here we can go ahead and start with our markup. So for the title of our web page, I'll just call this image slider, just like that. And then we are going to need to link to our CSS file. So I can just say link here, and Emmet should generate this link tag for us. And for the href, or the location of our CSS file, we can just say we want it to point to our style.css, which is right here in our image slider app folder, just like that. And so our CSS should be linked now. Alright, so that's pretty much all we have to do concerning the head tag of our HTML document. So next we're going to work on the body of our image slider app. So let's go into our body, and the first thing we're going to create is simply the container div that is going to contain our image slider. So in order to do that, I'm just going to put a dot here and then type slider. Slider, and push enter, and Emmet will then create for me a div with the class of slider. So inside our slider container, I'm going to do the same thing and create each of our slides. So in order to do that, I'll do the same thing. So dot slide, and that will create one of our slide instances. Inside each of our slide instances, we're going to have an image tag, and for the source of this image, I'm going to point to the images folder and just choose the first image, right? And for an alternative, if it cannot find this directory path for some reason, we can just put a 1 here. And what I'm going to do now is just select one of our slide instances and copy and paste twice, right? And then we can just change this one to number 2 and this one to number 3, just like this. So now we have our slider, just like that. Nice. Now that we have that, we can create the controls div, which is going to contain our buttons. So pretty much the same thing, just dot controls to create our div with a class of controls, and then we're going to have 2 buttons inside of here. So we can say button and then dot, and I'm going to say prev and push enter. So Emmet will now create a button with the class of prev. And for the inner text, I can say previous, just like that, and copy this down once. And this one will be our next button. So give it the class of next and the inner text of next. And believe it or not, that is all the markup we're going to need. So go ahead and save your project, and we can then go ahead and look at it in the browser. So in order to do this, we can say Control and B on VS Code, and that'll bring up our sidebar. Then we can just right click on our index.html and say Open with Live Server, and that should bring up a new browser window with our app here. And as you can see, our images are absolutely enormous, and we can't really make any kind of sense of our app yet because we haven't added any kind of CSS. So let's go ahead and fix that. Alright, so we're back over in our project and we're in our style.css file, and now we can start with our styling. So if you remember, we have a main container here with the class of slider. So let's go ahead and target that. So we can just say .slider over here and open that up with some curlies, and we're just going to want to give this a width of 100%, a height of 300 pixels. We want to set the overflow to hidden, and the position of our main container will be relative. So now if we look back at our app, we can at least now see that our buttons are here underneath our main slider, although our images are still huge, but at least we have made some improvements so far. So back over in our CSS file, now that we've done our main slider container, let's do each of the slides. So that's just .slide and then open it up with curlies. Let's set the width of each slide to 100% and the height as well to 100%. The position of each slide is going to be absolute. And for our top and left values, we're just going to set 0. So for top and left, there will be 0. And let's set our opacity to 0 as well. Right, so that should position each of our slides nicely within our slider container. So at the top and left corner, basically, with the position of absolute. And now we're going to add this transition property onto each of our slides, and what we're going to transition specifically is the opacity value for each of our slides, and we're going to specify 0.5 seconds. And finally, the style of the animation will be an ease in and out style animation for each of our slides. Now we can take care of the actual sizing of the image, and in order to do that, we can target the images by using the slide class and then specify an image tag. So what this means is any image tag within a slide class will have these properties, and I'm just going to set each of the images to have a width of 300 pixels as well as a height of 300 pixels. Now if we look back at our index.html file, something we can notice is that essentially each of these slides has a slide class, and what we can do with JavaScript is actually add on a active class dynamically, and that's how we're going to essentially display each image. So if we go back over to our CSS file under where we've done our image, specifying the width and the height for that. What we can do is just add the slide class and then chain on the active class, which we will add with our JavaScript. And what we want to do is just set the opacity here to 1. So anytime a slide is active, then it will have the opacity of 1. Next, we're going to target our controls, which contain our buttons, and we just want to add a little bit of margin top there, and we can just add about 10 pixels. Finally, for our buttons, the actual buttons themselves, we just want a little bit of padding on those just to space it out a bit. So we can add 5 pixels on the top and bottom and 10 pixels on the left and right. So now if you head over back to your app in the browser, what you can notice is that our buttons are here and look a bit better, but our images have disappeared. And the reason for this is that back over in our project, you remember that we set the opacity of each slide to 0. So that'll essentially make them disappear. But as soon as we add on our active class, that's when we'll reset our opacity back to 1, in which case they will become visible again. And just to illustrate this to you, I can change the opacity to 1 over here and save. And if we go back, then our images should reappear. So just to explain, that's how we're going to do things. And cool, I think that's it for our CSS. So let's jump into the JavaScript. Alright, so we're back over in our main.js file, and before we start doing anything, what we have to do is come down in our index.html file, and beneath our closing body tag, we can add a script tag over here. And the source of that script will need to be our main.js file. So remember to save this so your index.html file will read from your main.js script file. Cool. So back over in our main.js file, the first thing we're going to do is create a constant variable which will hold our slides. So in order to do this, we can say const slides equals document.querySelectorAll, and we can then pass in the slide class, so .slide. So what this will do is simply grab each of the slide class elements from the DOM and save them into an HTML collection called slides. So now that we have that, we can now create our tracker variable. So I'll just add a comment here called tracker variable, and this is going to be a let variable, so that means we can change it, whereas the constant we wouldn't be able to change. And this is going to track our current slide, and for now we will just set that to 0. So the main idea for the functionality of this app is we're going to basically just have 3 functions, and the first one is going to be for showing each of the slides, and the other 2 are going to be for cycling between each slide. So we will have one for the next slide when we click the next slide button, and we'll have one for the previous slide button. So what we can do first of all is create our function to show the slide. So in order to do that, we can say function, and we can name this show slide, just like that, and we will pass in an index, so that'll be obviously the index of which slide we want to show. And then what we're going to do inside this function is use our slides HTML collection that we created at the top, and we're going to use a for each on here. So we open up the for each and we take each slide that we're going to loop through. We can create an arrow function here and open them up like curlies, and inside our for each, what we're going to do is for each slide we're going to say slide dot class list dot remove, and then we're going to pass in the active class. So for each slide, we're going to remove the active class, and finally, we'll take our slides array at the index that we pass in, and again use the class list, and you can see my autocomplete is nicely correct there. What we want to do is add the active class onto that particular index. So that's pretty much it for our show slide function. Next we can create our next slide function. So that's function next slide. We won't pass in the index here. So for our next slide function, what we want to do is increment our tracker variable, right? So we can say current slide, and we can just use the ++ syntax in order to increment that by 1 every time we call the next slide function. Next, we're going to have a check in here, so a simple if statement. And what we're going to check is if the current slide is equal to the exactly, oh, not quite exactly. So we want to use a triple equals here to check if our current slide is equal to our slides.length, so the total number of our slides, which in our case is 3. So we just want to open up this if check, and if that is indeed the case, we just want to reset our current slide back to 0. Finally, all we have to do is then call our show slide function, which we created right over here. So let's call that, and we just want to call that with our current slide, right? Cool, so that's our next slide function, and our previous slide function is going to be rather similar to this. So what I'm going to do is just copy this and paste it over here, and we can just alter this a bit. So this is obviously going to be our previous slide function. Of course, instead of incrementing, we want to decrement, so minus it by 1 each time. And our check in here is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to check for the end, but rather if the current slide is less than 0. So if that is the case, we don't want to reset it to 0 here. What we want to do is just say our current slide is going to be equal to exactly that, the slides.length -1, right? And the reason for the -1 is just catering for the fact that we have a JavaScript array. So that's pretty much going to do it for our 3 functions. We have our show slide, our next slide, and our prev slide. Alright, so before we add our event listeners to our buttons to actually call these functions and make our app work, let's just go over the logic to make sure that you guys really understand what's going on. So our show slide function takes an index as a parameter, and it's responsible for showing the slide at that index by adding the active class to it. It first removes the active class from all the slides using the forEach method on the slides array, and then it adds the active class at the specified index. So that's our show slide. For our next slide function, so this is obviously going to be triggered whenever we click the next button. It increments the current slide variable by 1 and checks if it has reached the length of the slides array. If it has, it wraps around to the first slide by setting current slide back to 0. Finally, it calls the show slide function in order to show that slide. And our prev slide function works very similarly to our next slide function, but it decrements the current slide variable instead. So if the current slide becomes less than 0, it wraps around to the last slide by setting current slide to the slides.length -1. Cool, so now that we have all of that in place, we just need to add our event listeners, and, in theory at least, our app should work. So let's go ahead and do that. So underneath all of our logic here in our main.js, I'm going to use document.querySelector, and we're going to pass in the next class to grab our next button, And then we're going to use add event listener to listen for a click event, and we will pass in the next slide function as the parameter here. So whenever we click our next button, it'll call our next slide function, just like that. And a nice little trick here, in case you guys don't know, you can put your cursor right over here, hold down Shift and Alt, and then push the down arrow, and it'll copy this line of code for you. And this is going to be pretty much the same thing, but we're going to target the previous button. And a little mistake here is I forgot the inverted commas over here, so make sure you add those so it'll target your classes correctly. And so for our previous button, we just want to call our prev slide function, just like that. So if we head over back to our app, you can see that our images are displaying. We have our previous and next buttons over here, and if I click next, it will transfer to the next image. If I click previous, we can go back, and we have this nice little animation in between our images. That little fading is quite nice, I think. And feel free to go crazy with the CSS here, customize it. You can even add way more features onto this, but yeah, that's going to do it for this tutorial, and I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one. So have fun coding, and thanks for watching, guys. Bye bye.